Good afternoon. My name is Colette Watson, and welcome to Free Press Live, brought to you by Free Press, a nonprofit, nonpartisan media reform organization fighting for media and technology that promote a more just society. Every week on Wednesdays at 2:30 Eastern Time, we talk about the intersections of media, technology, and human rights. And today we're going to focus on how media has upheld anti-Asian racism. But before we get into our main topic today, here's a few stories from the world of communications rights. Emails obtained by the Los Angeles Times show that the LA Police Department repeatedly emailed area residents asking for their camera footage from Amazon's Ring home camera systems in the wake of protests following George Floyd's murder last year. Anti-surveillance advocates are sounding the alarm on the First Amendment implications and how Amazon's collaborations with law enforcement serve to further mass criminalize and incarceration of Black people and other people of color in this country. You can read more at latimes.com. In other reports, the New York Times has found that the city of Minneapolis will pay 6 social media influencers $2,000 each to share messages during the trials of Derek Chauvin and 3 other former police officers charged in the murder of George Floyd. Michelle Gross, the president of Communities United Against Police Brutality, a volunteer police accountability organization, said the program seems intended to manipulate the views of residents and activists. Michelle Gross said, quote, "I don't think this is about dismantling falsities. I think this is about crafting a narrative and controlling it. And I think people will see through it, frankly." Read more about this at newyorktimes.com. Today, though, we're focusing on how media has perpetuated anti-Asian racism today and throughout history, but especially in the wake of the attacks in Atlanta just 2 weeks ago. We have our featured guest, Jeff Chang, and special contributor, Joseph Torres. Before we get into that main conversation, though, I'd like to bring Joe on screen and introduce Joseph Torres, who I know is my colleague, Joe, here at Free Press. We work on the Media 2070 Media Reparations Project together. And Joe, you also recently wrote about how media harm has impacted AAPI communities. So I want to first of all say welcome and ask you about that blog and how really this work ties into your work on media reparations.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to have Jeff on this call on this show because he spent his life talking about cultural shifts. How do you shift culture, and how do you shift narratives to shift culture in order to create political change? And as someone who's been studying history and working on media history and working on the Media 2070 project, we have seen the long history of anti-Black racism in the media system, how the media system itself is a part, like any other system that was created in our country, was created to uphold a white racial hierarchy. And it did it through the creation of narratives, an anti-Black narrative, in order for political decisions to be made that ensured that slavery happened, or violence against the Black community, whether it's lynching or the policies we see to this day. And these narratives still hold true. And I was fortunate enough working on a book several years ago, Juan Gonzalez. Now that we talked a little bit about the history of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese racism in the media system, and the same is this, like the same kind of harms, violence perpetrated against the community. It was done just like it has in the indigenous community and the Latinx community and so forth, so on. So this is the history of white supremacy in the media system and the function it plays. So that's why I'm happy Jeff's here, because Jeff, has devoted like his life to like culture shifting, and obviously the things he's written before and the things he talked about after what happened in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, and also of course prior to that. So.
Absolutely. I'm excited too, Joe. Jeff's work is so wide ranging. Here in Arizona, where I'm based, he's done so much with our project at the Borderlands and just using culture and understanding narrative. And I want to just share with the audience watching that Jeff Chang is our special guest today. He has written extensively on culture, politics, the arts, and music. His first book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, was awarded the American Book Award as well as the Asian American Literary Award. And his book, We Gonna Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation, was declared the smartest book of the year by the Washington Post in 2016. And he also created a 4-episode digital adaptation for PBS of that book. He's co-founder of Culture Strike as well as Color Lines, and now senior advisor at Race Forward, and just an incredible advocate and culture worker, cultural strategist. So let's welcome Jeff Chang today. Hi, Jeff. How are you? Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with the two of you. Loving your work and deeply, deeply respecting and admiring your work for many, many, many years. So it's so good to be in place here with you all today.
Thank you, Jeff. We are so grateful. I want to, first of all, it's been 2 weeks now since the attacks in Atlanta, right? Which we all, have been horrified in the unfolding aftermath of that. And though this dynamic is not new, we understand that the media coverage of this story and others have been a part of perpetuating anti-Asian racism in our society. What narratives, well, first of all, what were your initial thoughts about the media coverage of these stories coming out of Atlanta? What narratives did you find troubling or examples of coverage? And then what examples of coverage do you think could be emulated where community voices were centered?
Great question. The thing that comes up for me first is when these events kind of happen, right? It's always really interesting to kind of see the early reporting that's happening. And one of the things that I saw happening in that early reporting was already sort of a humanization of the killer. That there were interviews with people in his neighborhood who referred to the neighborhood as a good neighborhood. This is a safe neighborhood. Nothing like this kind of thing ever happens around here, that he comes from a good Christian family. And so before we even knew who the victims were, what their names were, any of their stories, what we already had in the press was this sort of norming of a humanizing of the shooter, in the same way that we had after Charleston, the humanizing of Dylan Roof. The police went and got him a cheeseburger, and everybody was talking about, he's a kid who went astray. This is the early coverage. I think it got corrected very quickly, but it already revealed, I think, in that regard, a sense of how people view this particular neighborhood, this place where there's a lot of Latino, Latinx, and Asian American immigrants who are trying to make a living, working class folks, and that this was part of a narrative of saying he's one of us. And of course, this really picks up when you have Sheriff Jay Baker getting up and talking about how he just had a bad day. But I think it was part of the lead up to that. One of the things that I think was really good was that there has now been an inflection point where there's been a lot of coverage and a lot of voices, a lot of Asian Americans who've been doing the work for many, many years, talking about stereotyping of Asian American women, talking about what the race and class and immigration law types of backgrounds are on these narratives. And that's been really good to see.
One of the things that's which really always frustrating when you have is that it has to take like death and tragedy for voices to be heard, right? And the thing is, it's like when if you can talk a little bit about like the history of like what are these narratives that form, right, and the formation of it. What is you wrote about it in the Washington Post, you've written about it, in other places, but it's like what, can you talk about the history and formation of anti AAPI narratives that still exist today, and like what cultural political purposes do these actually narratives serve?
Well, the important thing to kind of understand is that these narratives go back hundreds of years, and they have to do with America's imperialism in Asia and the Pacific, right? many of us who are here in the continental U.S., we're here literally because of the backdrop of war, right? And so we're talking about histories of war and imperialism and U.S. aggression that have pushed people out of chaotic situations into trying to come to the U.S., right? And none of that is talked about. Instead, what we still have to live with are these narratives that were created during those particular times. So if you take it all the way back to the 19th century and Chinese immigrants coming to the U.S. in the wake of the Opium Wars, right? In which Western powers were literally pushing drugs onto the Chinese population and fighting a war against Western powers to prevent that from happening. And at that particular point, this notion of the sickly Chinese or the sick men of Asia being surfaced in the 19th century, that's really a direct connection to Donald Trump getting up and calling the coronavirus the Chinese flu. It's literally this 300-year-old narrative that Donald Trump was tapping into. And when you look at Sheriff Jay Baker's thing, this is why it was so insidious what he said, right? About trying to humanize the shooter. He said that the guy was trying to eliminate a problem, right? That he had a disease, sex addiction, and that this was something that he needed to do, was to go and eliminate the problem, right? So it really reduces Asian American women, and again, this stereotype goes back 300 years to objects that white men can ravage and use in any kind of way that they can, and that they're also sickly, that they're the ones who are the cause of this disease that Robert Allen Baker or Robert Allen Long had, and so these are long-standing narratives that we still deal with. This notion that Asian Americans are foreign, that they don't belong, and that they're sickly carriers of disease.
And so, like, during the 1850s, 1860s, as the population of Chinese migration to the West Coast happened, can you talk a little bit about what was the narratives back then in context of workers? What happened? The passage of the Page Act and all the first really restrictive immigration laws in our country. Can you mention about how this all developed into the kind of policies that harm the Asian community, but also the Chinese community, and but also the amount of violence there were against these communities?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The first restriction of any sort of racial group was targeted at Chinese and Asian women. That was an 1875 Page Act, in which President Ulysses Grant said, these women aren't coming here for wholesome purposes. He was already using that sex worker, that Asian Americans are hypersexualized, Asian women are hypersexualized objects for white men, that they're sex workers, that they're prostitutes, right? They use that to be able to ban Asian American women. And that leads up to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first time that immigration law in the US bans an explicit racial group. And that means that for the better part of the 20th century, Asians are not allowed to become citizens for the most part in the U.S. unless they're born here, and that's a birthright citizenship question that Asian Americans fought for based on the 14th Amendment. There's a whole history here of the Black freedom struggle influencing us and being able to make way places for Asian Americans to be able to come into the U.S. and feel a sense of belonging. We can get back to that in a second. But this is the deep history of it, that the narratives are tied deeply into this, and that Asian Americans are competing for jobs, that are taking away jobs from white folks, and that they therefore need to be excluded. And so you have a wave of violence that proceeds through the entire 20th century, all the way and up to now, that has its roots in these kinds of narratives.
Yeah, the newspapers at the time, whether it's the New York Times, papers in California, they were calling for the exclusion of Chinese, but they were also comparing them to a Black population, to indigenous population, that rights to, or to be taken away, like the right to actually be a witness against white folks in a trial, right? Because all murder around the gold rush and all, and in a trial that happened. So it's like the idea that newspapers, the mass media at the time was complicit. It was a part of this hierarchy. You had like politicians, the former governor, I believe, of New York, editorializing in the New York Times about how I believe Chinese are going to destroy this country, like black folks and the exclusion. So like, can you talk a little bit about the media narrative at the time? What role did media play at this time?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you see is as the sort of white working class begins to target Asian Americans in the late 19th century for violence, that oftentimes this is justified by the media, right? That when there are outbreaks, for instance, of the plague, right, or smallpox and that kind of thing, that rather than looking to the white carriers of this who are bringing it back from their travels or that kind of thing, they immediately attack Chinatown. And the cartoons that kind of surface at this particular point give this picture of Asian Americans being both, on the one hand, again, sickly carriers of disease, weak, right? Countries that are that we can run over and that we can sort of take their wealth on the one hand, and on the other hand, threats to the U.S. And to the American worker, not just in terms of jobs, right, but in terms of disease, of life, right? And so this is the kind of picture that develops of Asian Americans, and you can draw again a direct line to that to 1941, 1942, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066 that incarcerates Japanese Americans in camps all across the country. Take that all the way on up to 1989, right, where you've got somebody who identifies, a white supremacist who identifies with the U.S. Army, taking a shotgun, going to a school in Stockton and killing Southeast Asian children. That's one of the massacres that happened before Atlanta, right? Another one happened after 9/11, where South Asian, Sikh Americans, Muslim Americans are being targeted, and a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, becomes the place where a gunman goes in and kills Sikh Americans. And so this is sort of an ongoing type of thing. And through the whole thing, right, Asian Americans don't really have a voice. They aren't really able to express what their shock and horror is in this particular moment. They're simply just objects who have been killed and manipulated in that way by the media to appear again as foreigners.
Absolutely. Joseph, if I can jump in here for a quick second, I think that erasure and that attempted erasure and silencing that you're speaking to, Jeff, is so harmful, and it causes much trauma, I would say, as I witness what is unfolding. And that's why we undertook the Media 2070 project in many respects, because we wanted to visibilize media as a system. Oftentimes when we think about systemic harm, we're thinking of criminal justice, healthcare, but media is in fact a system that has further the white racial hierarchy in this country, and also deepened divisions in many ways, I think, between various groups experiencing white supremacy and colonialism. And I know that, recently in New York, I think just this week, there was a horrific attack against a Filipino woman there in New York, and that video went viral. And I wanted to, talk to you about that particular attack, of course, coming 2 weeks after Atlanta, but understanding that it's in a long history of violence against Asian Americans, but specifically wanted to tap into what this particular attack and the fact that it has gone viral portends for Black and Asian relations and how media plays a role in those relations today and historically.
Mm-hmm. Well, in order to kind of contextualize what's happened with the video that's gone viral this past week of a man kicking and then beating an elderly Asian American woman, a Filipino American woman who was going to church. In order to contextualize that, we have to go back to 1992 and the Los Angeles uprisings. And to note that at that particular time, media was able to really play up this notion that African Americans and Asian Americans, that Black and Asians just don't get along, right? The conflict was racialized very quickly, when the real reason that you have a lot of this stuff happening is because of racial segregation, because of segregation types of patterns. We saw precious little, I think, during that particular period about patterns of white flight or racial segregation or those kinds of things. We saw a lot about the supposed inability of Asian Americans and Blacks to be able to live together. And I think that what we see now in this particular moment is a fanning of the flames as this media goes viral all across the country. Just a couple of months ago, we saw the same thing kind of happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what we need to do, I think, on the grassroots level is to be able to reaffirm these very deep ties that we've had to each other, of mutual support, of solidarity, of influence. And that's exactly what we did here in the Bay Area, that a number of organizations got together and issued a statement and said, this is not about criminalizing Black folks, that this is about dealing with anti-Asian violence. We have to remember that white supremacy is the problem, that the tone was set by our previous president, that he was the one that declared an open season on Asian Americans by using the term China virus. He said that over and over again. He said, I'll give you 19 different ways I can say it, but you're not going to get me to stop saying that. And that normalized this moment in which violence can occur against Asian Americans. And so I think what we need to do in this moment is, again, to be able to come together, to be able to understand the interconnected histories, to be able to say that we're bigger than this, to look at the data, right? The data shows that perpetrators of anti-Asian violence are mostly not Black, right? Are mostly not Black. And that kind of data is never shown. Instead, what we get is the videos, and then we get subsequent reactions to that inflame kind of communities, tensions between different communities. We don't want to see this get back to 1991 and 1992 again. We've gone and moved on from that. We want to be able to kind of express our solidarity together as Asian Americans, and be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter.
If I can add, Colette, that like in some of the newspapers back when Chinese migration started happening, they were. I mean, the media narrative has also been like one that pits groups against each other. I mean, always has, right? And they would write literally like, we think Chinese laborers will be better than Black laborers because they're smarter.
Mm-hmm.
They're smarter and more intelligent and all this other stuff. So literally, the whole stereotype, right, started happening. And we've seen the media pit people against each other. And then you look at social media today after this incident, folks said, how is this white supremacy when we have Black folks attacking Asian American folks, right? And so we still see that narrative, regardless of the platform that changes in the media, that narrative continues, right? And so I just wanted to add that. And if we can get you at least two more questions, Jeff. Like I have a personal one that like really touched me when I heard you on the Vox podcast, and the idea of like you said something like, I didn't know this history growing up, right? That was correct, right? I mean, I'm a Puerto Rican kid from New York City, and like I didn't know my own history, and I'm still learning my own history growing up, and like, and what is the impact when you learn this history? How does it make more sense of your life? Like, and the circumstances of who you are and your family and your community. Like, how does this put this more in the proper context to make you understand better who you are and your place in this world? I'm just curious because I identify with that, and we don't, as people of color, like you write great about race, or Colette writes great about race, is because like folks work at it, because it's not taught to us in school. So I wanted the opportunity to talk about that.
I mean, thanks for asking that question. It's always a recovery project, right? Our histories are hidden histories, and these histories have to be surfaced and serviced, right? We need to be able to put those histories into the record, one of the things that we're seeing now is an inflection point where there is a lot of writing, a lot of Asian American voices that are getting out there, being able to tell the stories that have not been told, but to be able to talk about the histories of solidarity between communities of color, right? That's super, super important. And as you said, of the pitting of us against each other, the Asian American model minority myth, and how that was used to further anti-Black racism, further bigotry and discrimination against Latinx folks, right? Those things kind of need to be told. For me, what it did was it helped to drop things into place. I could start making sense of what was happening behind me, all around me, how I related to the world by being able to study and understand and center Asian American and Pacific Islander histories, to be able to understand how I got here, right? And so I think it's really, really powerful. And I think that that's the promise of what you all do with your work towards cultural justice and towards media justice, is to be able to make sure that all of these stories are told, that the history of the US becomes a transformative one, doesn't remain one that divides us, that segregates us, and that oppresses us.
Thank you, Jeff. Excuse me. It's just such an honor and a privilege to be engaged in cultural justice work, following in, honestly, your lineage, which continues, and Joe, yours as well. I think as we look at just the work that has happened through the years, through Culture Strike, Color Lines, so many of your efforts. It's really an honor to think of Media 2070 and the things that we're doing at Free Press as within that lineage. And honestly, toward realizing a world where we can be safe, and where media is no longer upholding the narratives that not only divide us, but subject us to premature death. And I just want to say real quickly, we talked about the attack in New York, and I do want to uplift the victim of Monday's attack in Manhattan, whose name has been identified as Vilma Kari. Ms. Kari's daughter said that her mother immigrated from the Philippines decades ago, and has declined to comment further, but we just want to uplift that family and make sure that we are centering the fact that people are being hurt and harmed and injured and murdered, and that is not the type of community that we want to live in. We want to be in a place where all of our folks can be safe from interpersonal harm, and of course from the harm of white supremacy. So I thank you for your work, Jeff. Joe, I thank you for letting me work with you every day. and to everyone tuning in here at Free Press Live, where can we continue to follow you, Jeff?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Zentronics, and jeffchang.net. And thank you so much for this time.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, you can tune in every week at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Free Press Live is at facebook.com/freepress. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next week.